Candide by Voltaire. Chapter 10. In what distress Candide, Cunegonde, and the old woman arrived at Cadiz, and of their embarkation. "Who was it that robbed me of my money and jewels?" said Cunegonde, all bathed in tears. "How shall we live? What shall we do? Where find inquisitors or Jews who will give me more?" "Alas," said the old woman, "I have a shrewd suspicion of a reverend Grey Friar who stayed last night in the same inn with us at Badajoz. God preserve me from judging rashly, but he came into our room twice, and he set out upon his journey long before us." "Alas," said Candide, "dear Pangloss has often demonstrated to me that the goods of this world are common to all men, and that each has an equal right to them. But according to these principles, the Grey Friar ought to have left us enough to carry us through our journey. Have you nothing at all left, my dear Cunegonde?" "Not a farthing," said she. "What then must we do?" said Candide. "Sell one of the horses," replied the old woman. "I will ride behind Miss Cunegonde, although I can hold myself only on one buttock, and we shall reach Cadiz." In the same inn there was a Benedictine prior, who bought the horse for a cheap price. Candide, Cunegonde, and the old woman, having passed through Lucena, Chilas, and Lebrixa, arrived at length in Cadiz. A fleet was there getting ready, and troops assembling to bring to reason the reverend Jesuit fathers of Paraguay, accused of having made one of the native tribes in the neighborhood of San Sacrament revolt against the kings of Spain and Portugal. Candide, having been in the Bulgarian service, performed the military exercise before the general of this little army with so graceful an address, with so intrepid an air, and with such agility and expedition, that he was given the command of a company of foot. Now he was a captain. He set sail with Miss Cunegonde, the old woman, 2 valets, and the 2 Andalusian horses, which had belonged to the Grand Inquisitor of Portugal. During their voyage they reasoned a good deal on the philosophy of poor Pangloss. "We are going into another world," said Candide, "and surely it must be there that all is for the best. For I must confess there is reason to complain a little of what passeth in our world, in regard to both natural and moral philosophy." "I love you with all my heart," said Cunegonde, "but my soul is still full of fright at that which I have seen and experienced." "All will be well," replied Candide. "The sea of this new world is already better than our European sea. It is calmer, the winds more regular. It is certainly the new world which is the best of all possible worlds." "God grant it," said Cunegonde, "but I have been so horribly unhappy there that my heart is almost closed to hope." "You complain," said the old woman. "Alas, you have not known such misfortunes as mine." Cunegonde almost broke out laughing, finding the good woman very amusing for pretending to have been as unfortunate as she. "Alas," said Cunegonde, "my good mother, unless you have been ravished by 2 Bulgarians, have received 2 deep wounds in your belly, have had 2 castles demolished, have had 2 mothers cut to pieces before your eyes, and 2 of your lovers whipped at an auto da fe, I do not conceive how you could be more unfortunate than I. Add that I was born a baroness of 72 quarterings, and have been a cook." "Miss," replied the old woman, "you do not know my birth, and were I to show you my backside, you would not talk in that manner, but would suspend your judgment." This speech having raised extreme curiosity in the minds of Cunegonde and Candide, the old woman spoke to them as follows. End Chapter 10. Chapter 11. History of the Old Woman. "I had not always bleared eyes and red eyelids, neither did my nose always touch my chin, nor was I always a servant. I am the daughter of Pope Urban X and of the Princess of Palestrina. Until the age of 14 I was brought up in a palace, to which all the castles of your German barons would scarcely have served for stables. And one of my robes was worth more than all the magnificence of Westphalia. As I grew up, I improved in beauty, wit, and every graceful accomplishment, in the midst of pleasures, hopes, and respectful homage. Already I inspired love. My throat was formed, and such a throat, white, firm, shaped like that of the Venus of Medici. And what eyes, what eyelids, what black eyebrows! Such flames darted from my dark pupils that they eclipsed the scintillation of the stars, as I was told by the poets in our part of the world. My waiting women, when dressing and undressing me, used to fall into an ecstasy, whether they viewed me before or behind. How glad would the gentlemen have been to perform that office for them! I was affianced to the most excellent prince of Massa Carrara. Such a prince! As handsome as myself, sweet-tempered, agreeable, brilliantly witty, and sparkling with love. I loved him as one loves for the first time, with idolatry, with transport. The nuptials were prepared. There was surprising pomp and magnificence. There were fetes, carousals, continual opera bouffe, and all Italy composed sonnets in my praise, though not one of them was passable. I was just upon the point of reaching the summit of bliss, when an old marchioness, who had been mistress to the prince, my husband, invited him to drink chocolate with her. He died in less than 2 hours of most terrible convulsions. But this is only a bagatelle. My mother, in despair, and scarcely less afflicted than myself, determined to absent herself for some time from so fatal a place. She had a very fine estate in the neighbourhood of Gaeta. We embarked on board a galley of the country, which was gilded like the great altar of St. Peter's at Rome. A Sallee corsair swooped down and boarded us. Our men defended themselves like the Pope's soldiers. They flung themselves upon their knees and threw down their arms, begging of the corsair an absolution in articulo mortis. Instantly they were stripped as bare as monkeys. My mother, our maids of honour, and myself were all served in the same manner. It is amazing with what expedition those gentry undress people. But what surprised me most was that they thrust their fingers into the part of our bodies which the generality of women suffer no other instrument but pipes to enter. It appeared to me a very strange kind of ceremony, but thus one judges of things when one has not seen the world. I afterwards learned that it was to try whether we had concealed any diamonds. This is the practice established from time immemorial among civilized nations that scour the seas. I was informed that the very religious knights of Malta never fail to make this search when they take any Turkish prisoners of either sex. It is a law of nations, from which they never deviate. I need not tell you how great a hardship it was for a young princess and her mother to be made slaves and carried to Morocco. You may easily imagine all we had to suffer on board the pirate vessel. My mother was still very handsome. Our maids of honour and even our waiting women had more charms than are to be found in all Africa. As for myself, I was ravishing, was exquisite, grace itself, and I was a virgin. I did not remain so long. This flower, which had been reserved for the handsome Prince of Massa Carrara, was plucked by the corsair captain. He was an abominable negro, and yet believed that he did me a great deal of honour. Certainly the Princess of Palestrina and myself must have been very strong to go through all that we experienced until our arrival in Morocco. But let us pass on. These are such common things as not to be worth mentioning. Morocco swam in blood when we arrived. 50 sons of the Emperor Muley Ismail had each their adherents. This produced 50 civil wars, of blacks against blacks, and blacks against Tonys, and Tonys against Tonys, and mulattoes against mulattoes. In short, it was a continual carnage throughout the empire. No sooner were we landed than the blacks of a contrary faction to that of my captain attempted to rob him of his booty. Next to jewels and gold, we were the most valuable things he had. I was witness to such a battle as you have never seen in your European climates. The northern nations have not that heat in their blood, nor that raging lust for women so common in Africa. It seems that you Europeans have only milk in your veins, but it is vitriol, it is fire which runs in those of the inhabitants of Mount Atlas and the neighboring countries. They fought with the fury of the lions, tigers, and serpents of the country to see who should have us. A Moor seized my mother by the right arm, while my captain's lieutenant held her by the left. A Moorish soldier had hold of her by one leg, and one of our corsairs held her by the other. Thus almost all our women were drawn in quarters by 4 men. My captain concealed me behind him, and with his drawn scimitar cut and slashed every one that opposed his fury. At length I saw all our Italian women, and my mother herself, torn, mangled, massacred by the monsters who disputed over them. The slaves, my companions, those who had taken them, soldiers, sailors, blacks, whites, mulattoes, and at last my captain, all were killed, and I remained dying on a heap of dead. Such scenes as this were transacted through an extent of 300 leagues, and yet they never missed the 5 prayers a day ordained by Mohammed. With difficulty I disengaged myself from such a heap of slaughtered bodies, and crawled to a large orange tree on the bank of a neighboring rivulet, where I fell, oppressed with fright, fatigue, horror, despair, and hunger. Immediately after, my senses, overpowered, gave themselves up to sleep, which was yet more swooning than repose. I was in this state of weakness and insensibility, between life and death, when I felt myself pressed by something that moved upon my body. I opened my eyes, and saw a white man of good countenance, who sighed, and who said between his teeth, "Oce sicura de essere senza coglioni." End chapter 11. Chapter 12. The Adventures of the Old Woman continued. Astonished and delighted to hear my native language, and no less surprised at what this man said, I made answer that there were much greater misfortunes than that of which he complained. I told him in a few words of the horrors which I had endured, and fainted a second time. He carried me to a neighboring house, put me to bed, gave me food, waited on me, consoled me, flattered me. He told me that he had never seen anyone so beautiful as I, and that he never so much regretted the loss of what it was impossible to recover. "I was born at Naples," said he. "There they gild 2,000 or 3,000 children every year. Some die of the operation, others acquire a voice more beautiful than that of women, and others are raised to offices of state. This operation was performed on me with great success, and I was chapel musician to Madam, the Princess of Palestrina." "To my mother?" cried I. "Your mother?" cried he, weeping. "What? Can you be that young princess whom I brought up until the age of 6 years, and who promised so early to be as beautiful as you?" "It is I indeed, but my mother lies 400 yards hence, torn in quarters under a heap of dead bodies." I told him all my adventures, and he made me acquainted with his, telling me that he had been sent to the Emperor of Morocco by a Christian power to conclude a treaty with that prince, in consequence of which he was to be furnished with military stores and ships to help to demolish the commerce of other Christian governments. "My mission is done," said the honest eunuch. "I go to embark for Ceuta, and I will take you to Italy. Marche sicura de seres in the colpione. I thanked him with tears of commiseration, and instead of taking me to Italy, he conducted me to Algiers, where he sold me to the Dey. Scarcely was I sold, and the plague, which had made the tour of Africa, Asia, and Europe, broke out with great malignancy in Algiers. You have seen earthquakes, but pray, miss, have you ever seen the plague? Never, answered Cunegonde. If you had, said the old woman, you would acknowledge that it is far more terrible than an earthquake. It is common in Africa, and I caught it. Imagine to yourself the distressed situation of the daughter of a pope, only 15 years old, who in less than 3 months had felt the miseries of poverty and slavery, had been ravished almost every day, had beheld her mother drawn in quarters, had experienced famine and war, and was dying of the plague in Algiers. I did not die, however, but my eunuch, and the Dey, and almost the whole seraglio of Algiers perished. As soon as the first fury of this terrible pestilence was over, a sale was made of the Dey's slaves. I was purchased by a merchant and carried to Tunis. This man sold me to another merchant, who sold me again to another at Tripoli. From Tripoli I was sold to Alexandria, from Alexandria to Smyrna, and from Smyrna to Constantinople. At length I became the property of an Aga of the Janissaries, who was soon ordered away to the defense of Azov, then besieged by the Russians. The Aga, who was a very gallant man, took his whole seraglio with him, and lodged us in a small fort on the Palus Meotides, guarded by 2 black eunuchs and 20 soldiers. The Turks killed prodigious numbers of the Russians, but the latter had their revenge. Azov was destroyed by fire, the inhabitants put to the sword, neither sex nor age was spared, until there remained only our little fort, and the enemy wanted to starve us out. The 20 Janissaries had sworn they would never surrender. The extremities of famine to which they were reduced obliged them to eat our 2 eunuchs, for fear of violating their oath, and at the end of a few days they resolved also to devour the women. We had a very pious and humane imam, who preached an excellent sermon, exhorting them not to kill us all at once. "Only cut off a buttock of each of those ladies," said he, "and you'll fare extremely well. If you must go to it again, there will be the same entertainment a few days hence. Heaven will accept of so charitable an action, and send you relief." He had great eloquence. He persuaded them. We underwent this terrible operation. The Imam applied the same balsam to us as he does to children after circumcision, and we all nearly died. Scarcely had the Janissaries finished the repast with which we had furnished them, than the Russians came in flat-bottomed boats. Not a Janissary escaped. The Russians paid no attention to the condition we were in. There are French surgeons in all parts of the world. One of them, who was very clever, took us under his care. He cured us, and as long as I live I shall remember that as soon as my wounds were healed, he made proposals to me. He bid us all be of good cheer, telling us that the like had happened in many sieges, and that it was according to the laws of war. As soon as my companions could walk, they were obliged to set out for Moscow. I fell to the share of a boyard, who made me his gardener, and gave me 20 lashes a day. But this nobleman having in 2 years' time been broke upon the wheel, along with 30 more boyards for some broils at court, I profited by that event. I fled. I traversed all Russia. It was a long time an innholder's servant at Riga, the same at Rostock, at Wismar, at Leipzig, at Kassel, at Utrecht, at Leyden, at The Hague, at Rotterdam. I waxed old in misery and disgrace. having only one half of my posteriors, and always remembering I was a pope's daughter. 100 times I was upon the point of killing myself, but still I loved life. This ridiculous foible is perhaps one of our most fatal characteristics, for is there anything more absurd than to wish to carry continually a burden which one can always throw down, to detest existence, and yet to cling to one's existence, in brief, to caress the serpent which devours us, till he has eaten our very heart? In the different countries which it has been my lot to traverse, and the numerous inns where I have been servant, I have taken notice of a vast number of people who held their own existence in abhorrence, and yet I never knew of more than 8 who voluntarily put an end to their misery. 3 Negroes, 4 Englishmen, and a German professor named Robeck. I ended by being servant to the Jew, Don Issachar, who placed me near your presence, my fair lady. I am determined to share your fate, and have been much more affected with your misfortunes than with my own. I would never even have spoken to you of my misfortunes had you not piqued me a little, and if it were not customary to tell stories on board a ship in order to pass away the time. In short, Miss Cunegonde, I have had experience. I know the world. Therefore, I advise you to divert yourself, and prevail upon each passenger to tell his story. And if there be one of them all that has not cursed his life many a time, that has not frequently looked upon himself as the unhappiest of mortals, I give you leave to throw me head foremost into the sea. End chapter 12.